When moralism triumphs, it shakes and crumbles. At the Abyss by Christian Frehner, Switzerland.
12th of April, 2023. In all corners of politics, society and the economy, cracks are widening, the foundations are rumbling, and the dust is getting thicker. Not only in Switzerland, but worldwide. Discomfort, insecurity, worries about the future and existence, pessimism, fatalism, anger, reclusiveness, loneliness, hatred and depressiveness, etc. are spreading through the blood veins of society and clumping together to form an emotional mixture that is constantly growing, with holes opening up in many places that are releasing some pressure in the form of demonstrations, blockades, and other riots, etc. For the majority of people, however, the pressure is still on. For the majority of people, however, everything remains diffuse because they are not capable of an analytical overall view. The reason for this is that the people are deliberately kept in the dark about the agreements, decisions, and planning that are going on in the background. In plain language, the people are kept ignorant by means of concealments, lies, and false promises, etc., which in principle is not difficult in view of the widespread faith, not only religious but also ideological, philosophical, or other. In any case, the signs are stormy. The religious wars in Europe and US America are back. Modern crusaderism is spreading like a cancer. Sectarians still, veganism sticking to the streets, conspiracy mania, outrage, addiction, opinion terrorism wherever you look, and discord, implacability, envy, baseness, lack of understanding, and compassion that is limited to one's own clan. Previously positive concepts are ridiculed into the opposite. Wanting to understand something, because understanding something is the first step towards rational action, is devalued into the opposite. What could be observed after the outbreak of the pandemic at the beginning of 2020, namely a total failure of leadership in politics and the resulting confusion and hysteria in large parts of the population, has now, 3 years later, shifted to another topic, the war in Ukraine. Back then, the sensible, silent third of the Swiss population that refused to be.
I'm sorry to inform you, but I have to remove this part from the YouTube video due to YouTube's rules. There are links to the full text and a full video in the description below.
Hysteria is rampant, a kind of social media appendicitis, the so-called gendering. This brings up associations with neo-speak, namely the ideological reinterpretation of the language of George Orwell's novel 1984. For all those who have not yet read this dystopian novel, here is the motto from the Ministry of Truth Mini-True of Oceania. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. What was then a possibility looming in the skies of destiny is now a reality. Cheekily and unashamedly, the mature and self-thinking readership is served a toxic mix of bogus truths by means of tendentious titles and the use of adjectives and nouns ideologically colored according to individual verdict, good or bad, which corresponds to harassment, to put it mildly. Of course, this is not noticed by the believers in authority who hang on the lips of the political and religious leaders and or the often incompetent pseudo-experts of all scientific directions and take their thanks to the use of many quotations from authors wanting to convey an elevated level of education, explanations, etc. at face value. Letting others think for you and surfing along on waves of indignation saves you the necessary mental effort and frees up time to go off into the digital meta-universe and become stupid there. An apt example can be found in today's newspaper edition CH Media in an article written by Ernst Trummer, which is titled as follows: Why does Vladimir Putin fear this woman? For a year now, the Petersburg artist Sasha Skochilenko has been in prison. Her only offense, she painted peace messages on supermarket price tags. The message, aha, President Putin personally had this woman jailed, possibly overriding the entire judicial apparatus, and now he sits in his office, and between all his daily decisions to be made, he thinks of this artist with trepidation every now and then, because, quote, the Kremlin is so afraid of such a human being that it keeps him locked away for as long as possible. Apart from the fact that the artist is fortunately not in a secret CIA torture prison, she can at least paint in her cell and meanwhile have her paintings exhibited in London under the title The Price of Freedom. This newspaper article exemplifies the mixing of propaganda, ideology, and opinion-making, etc., based on real processes and events. It becomes very problematic and actually unacceptable and reprehensible when this pattern is applied in the warlike field of tension between the USA, NATO, EU, Russia, China, and thereby directly or indirectly promotes murder and destruction. Instead of facts and opinions being neatly separated, which is what decent journalism is all about, an emotionally charged, sometimes sneering, condescending, and opinion-manipulating, one-sidedly colored mishmash often pours into the eyes and ears of media consumers and clogs or numbs their brainwaves. On the one hand, the ability to maintain a critical distance and the activation and normal function of the intelligentum is switched off by the non-stop data input. And on the other hand, the majority of consumers are seduced into outrage mode. The information flows and overflows. Like the legendary Pied Piper of Hamelin, the propagandistically manipulated or hypnotized target persons move in the direction intended for them, whereby at the destination, however, all sorts of other things await, except freedom, security, and peace. Actually, it would be the noble task of the media, of journalism, instead of being the mouthpieces of the politicians, to keep an eye on all high decision-makers and to inform the people about what is going badly and what is going well, so that bad things can be avoided or developed into good things, and above all, so that incompetent and criminally acting persons can be removed from their leadership positions. All this requires that the focus be shifted away from ideology and propaganda and towards reality, and that any obfuscation, lies, manipulation, aberrations and threats, etc., be immediately addressed and exposed. Much of what is presented to information consumers by the mainstream, but also by countless alternative, esoteric, and ideological and other online media, can justifiably be described as imposition, degeneracy, and slander, and in part even as criminal. In order to remedy all the abuses described above in clear and intentionally forceful terms, a sober assessment of the situation is required, as well as valuable character traits such as impartiality, philanthropy, lack of ideology, and the will to deal only with reality or to work it out of the whole ideological swamp. The following list of real, that is to say, it is so realities, are intended as a thought-provoking basis for finally giving earthly humanity clear wine and enabling it to free itself from its ideologically faithfully clouded mental bondage and to create good conditions for free thinking to become possible, which logically can only function fully in the truth given by reality.
The fact is,
A state is a real democracy when the people are the sovereign, supreme decision-making authority and can determine the following: electing and voting out of office all leaders of the municipality, canton, sub-state, country, and the courts, submitting initiatives at constitutional and legislative level to change, amend them, taking the referendum on laws passed by Parliament. On Earth, only one country fulfills the majority of these rights, namely Switzerland. However, since the Swiss electorate does not directly elect the Federal Council, 7-member government, nor the federal judges, it must be judged as a semi-democracy. All other countries on Earth are not democracies because the peoples can only elect women and men to Parliament or as presidency every few years, if at all, who then can act and determine freely according to their own ideology and interests, and in disregard of their campaign promises, explicitly also directed against the interests and welfare of the people.
the fact is,
Since this article is in German and written by a Swiss, the opportunity is taken to point out that Germany is not an independent, sovereign state like its neighbors, but a kind of colony, because on the one hand there are enclaves on its territory that correspond to US territory, where nuclear weapons are stored and on or in which Germany has no say. On the other hand, Germany has only a basic law imposed on it by the victorious powers, but not a normal constitution which was put into force by the German people through a referendum and could be revised according to their own will. This, nota bene, in contrast to Russia or other undemocratic and dictatorial countries where a constitution legalized by popular vote is in force.
the fact is,
If all countries on Earth had neutrality as a state maxim and strictly adhered to it, there would be no war worldwide. Neutrality is an absolute concept, which means that it cannot be relativized or ideologically bent, just as pregnancy is an absolute concept because a woman is either pregnant or not. Neutrality applied at the country or state level means that there is no interference whatsoever in the affairs of other states. State activities in other countries are only allowed at their request. For example, when it comes to conflict resolution or peace negotiations, good officers, no direct or indirect warring party may be supplied with weapons. No sanctions, punitive actions of an economic, military, propaganda, or other nature are permitted. No membership of transnational alliances of interest is permitted. Membership in a federation of all worldwide states is only possible if this federation is absolutely non-violent, that is to say, consultative, if all members are equal in voting, etc., and if binding decisions require unanimity. This principle, applied in private, starting with the education of children, would also avoid much strife, suffering, and destruction, etc., because it would increase the likelihood that adults would think and act like real adults, namely reasonably.
The fact is,
The European Union is an administration and sanctioning octopus which realistically has to be described as a dictatorship because it has only sham democratic structures, since the country representatives and leaders, etc., are hoisted into their offices and posts without direct popular election. Furthermore, the EU interferes in the domestic affairs of the member countries and is anxious to constantly extend its monopoly on decision-making at the expense of the local populations, as well as to torpedo the principle of unanimity in decision-making.
the fact is,
If the economic, political, military balance of power is viewed globally, the following peculiarities, among others, become apparent. The USA is the only state on Earth that has not been attacked by another country since its founding in 1787, nor is it currently under any concrete military threat. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor or the stationing of nuclear missiles on Cuba by the Soviet Union were not based on any invasion plans, but on threat situations for which the USA was causally responsible. The USA operates about 800 known military bases in more than 80 countries, which corresponds to about 90 to 95% of all foreign military bases in the world. There are 194 military bases in Germany alone, and 121 in Japan, which was defeated by the USA. Russia maintains military bases in about 10 countries, most of them in the neighboring former Soviet republics. China maintains a single military base abroad in Africa. The 15 largest defense companies in the world are distributed among the following countries: USA, 7, China, 4, France, Italy, Great Britain, and Europe Airbus, 1 each. The largest 5 are US corporations. In 2021, the USA once again led the ranking in terms of defense spending by a huge margin in billions of USD. USA 3-1, China 93, UK 68.0, France 56.6, Italy 32. Russia, together with China, the main opponent of the enormous Western military phalanx, spent only a fraction, 65.9 billion USD. In the last World War, the two countries attacked, Russia by Germany and China by Japan, had to suffer by far the highest blood toll, with 24 and 20 million dead respectively, far ahead of Germany with 7.7 million, Great Britain with 450,000, and the USA with 420,000 dead. All of the major wars waged by the USA overseas in alleged defense of freedom, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, including the widespread use of chemical, biological and nuclear uranium munitions, weapons, ended in defeat for US America and resulted in millions of deaths, immense destruction, and, in some cases, the collapse of civilization and society, and terrorist anarchy Taliban, Al-Qaeda, IS. It is remarkable that none of these US war crimes have ever led to sanctions of any kind against the USA, in stark contrast to the current case of the special military operation triggered by Russia in Ukraine, a war in which, for the first time in over 100 years, more military personnel are killed or injured than civilians, according to the former head of the ICRC, Peter Maurer, among others. This raises the question, could it be that if the US were to completely stop its military and intelligence activities beyond its borders, reduce its arms industry by 99%, and instead devote itself to fighting grievances at home, that warfare in the rest of the world would be massively reduced? The fact is that a butcher needs animals to slaughter, process, and sell in order to earn a living and to practice his trade. The arms industry needs wars to maintain sales and profits, and while the top dog determines the business and keeps it going, free riders crowd around him and others take precautions.
The fact is,
there are no hegemonic signs whatsoever that Russia, which is not to be confused with the Soviet Union, wants to expand imperialistically beyond its sphere of influence, the bordering former Soviet republics in the Asian region, and make other countries compliant, for example, through sanctions. In terms of resources, Russia is self-sufficient. That is to say, Russia can produce everything necessary for life from and with its own resources. Moreover, the Russian language is hardly spoken on Earth outside Russia, just as over 90% of the Russian population does not speak English. What would entice the Russian government, let alone the Russian people, to expose themselves to Russophobic harassment far from home, or to take over foreign governments? After all, it is not least thanks to President Putin's perseverance and foresight that Russia is enjoying steady and stable economic progress, despite many years of sanctions by the hostile Western states. That is to say, the country has developed like a phoenix from the ashes of the more or less bankrupt Soviet carcass under Boris Yeltsin into an infrastructurally and socially progressive country. The fact that Russia is making efforts to avoid the capital, mistakes that are continuously aggravated or allowed to slip and become practically unsolvable in the West due to the decadence and incompetence of those in power and the arrogance of the elites over the lowly intelligent and uneducated people, should not be misjudged as populism, but should be appreciatively respected as a sign of applied reason and far-sightedness, etc. Obviously, the arrogance prevailing in the West and the view from the high horse blinds us to the state and social degeneration in the Anglo-American European area. Open borders and abuse of the asylum system, non-application of laws, widening wage gap, hypocrisy, measuring with different yardsticks, moralism, gendering, euthanasia.
the fact is,
On the 2nd of February 1990, at the Security Conference in Munich, the foreign ministers of the USA and Germany, Baker and Genscher, made a verbal promise to the then Soviet Union that, in return for agreeing to German reunification, NATO would not extend one step eastwards. A good 30 years later, the so-called Minsk Treaty, which aimed to end the civil war in Ukraine that had been going on since 2014, was about to be signed by Ukraine and Russia and the other contracting parties, namely on the 1st of April 2022 in Istanbul, when British Prime Minister Boris Johnson intervened in Kiev, demanded that Kiev not sign, and held out the prospect of unlimited military aid as a substitute. And as ex-German Chancellor Angela Merkel and ex-French President Hollande among others, later admitted the Western contracting parties were never interested in fulfilling the treaty anyway, but used the years of negotiations with trusting Vladimir Putin to arm and train the Ukrainian army against Russia. To be cheekily lied to twice and insidiously deceived, especially by figures who constantly and unashamedly blather about community of values and put themselves on the pedestal as moral shining lights, and then just carry on and trustingly reach out for negotiations a third time. Not even devout Christians would turn the cheek mentioned in the New Testament a third time to be beaten, especially when it comes to death or life.
The fact is,
Just as the USA would never allow Russia to station missiles in the north of Mexico and arm the Mexican military with weapons, Russia will also never allow a Russophobia-infested, hostile elite and their combined military power, which publicly communicates a policy of weakening and isolating Russia from the world community, to set up its missile arsenal directed against Russia and not far from Moscow. So it is already clear that NATO will fail with its plan to place its strategic weapons or even establish military bases on the territory of Ukraine. And it is already foreseeable that Finland's decision to join NATO, instead of maintaining its relatively neutral relationship with Russia, can or will have nasty consequences. If, as is foreseeable, the country allows NATO, that is to say the USA, to station offensive weapons against Russia on its territory, which would be tantamount to an unacceptable threat situation a la Mexico for Russia, the European vassals of the USA must be aware that not a limited special military operation is to be expected, but that a fiery shower of thunder will ensure that the European part of NATO is definitely checkmated. What will then remain is the biblical weeping and gnashing of teeth for he who does not think will suffer.
the fact is,
As was the case in the run-up to the last two world wars, when demagogues created an enthusiasm for war that immediately led to the disaster that was roared forth, we are obviously and unfortunately once again in the same dangerous situation, as was pointed out in the first part of this article. Even today, the demagogues, the warmongers, as well as the imaginary pseudo-experts, and in the background, the dark news distortion and lie production departments are active. And all these on TV and in the editorials, etc., and all those on the correct side of history who condemn dissenting opinions, as well as many of those who have been elevated to the status of luminaries, do not realize that they themselves have fallen victim to deceptive propaganda and, in their arrogance and delusions of do-gooderism, are unconsciously wandering along as puppets, hooked on by active forces that have remained unrecognized in the background since the reign of war criminal Harry S. Truman, who ordered the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs in Japan, to put it cryptically.
the fact is,
War in any form is always and without exception a crime against humanity and humanity, because war is always and without exception associated with death, destruction, and suffering. No war is ever justified, and every war is a civilizational indictment of humanity as such, as well as proof of a lack of logic, reason, and understanding, as well as a sign of lousy ethics and morals. Even if every war is triggered by leaders, the peoples are partly to blame because they elected these incompetent persons to their offices or did not remove them in time. Self-defense is only justified where there is a direct personal attack on oneself or a fellow human being, whereby this self-defense must in any case be primarily aimed at rendering the attacking party immobile or defenseless, but not at killing them. Killing in self-defense must always remain the ultimo ratio. Any kind of sanctions against other countries, etc., correspond to a war with non-explosive weapons because it is shamefully accepted that somewhere in the sanctioned country, or in one's own country, innocent people suffer the consequences and have to give up their lives prematurely. Imposing and implementing sanctions shows the rotten character of the decision-makers as well as their vindictive behavior, self-aggrandizement, striving for power and mental limitations, etc. A rather unconventional, thought-provoking suggestion on the subject of self-defense and armed neutrality. Instead of defending oneself against an enemy, wouldn't it be much smarter not to maintain an army oneself, but only a disaster service plus police? If you don't have an army, you are also not suitable as a target for attack. And in the case of a possible enemy occupation, there is no need for the destruction of infrastructure caused by attack and defense. Besides, we know from history that every violent regime has collapsed and disappeared sooner or later. P.S. In the case of Ukraine, the war would have ended after the signing of the Minsk Agreement on 1st April 2022 and the start of the implementation of the envisaged regulations.
The fact is,
Death penalty, torture and ill treatment, etc., exercised, legitimized and tolerated by a state and its secret services, military and authorities, are proof that this state and its population are still morally and ethically in a primitive, early medieval state of development, far from any civilizational progress. Human beings who are ethically, morally and attitudinally at this stage of development are either psychopathically predisposed or trapped in a faith-based, religious ideological mindset that practically makes it impossible for them to react and act as true human beings in times of stress and emotional turmoil, etc., that is to say, without revenge, violence, destruction, and other degenerations. They are trapped in the reprehensible and inhuman as well as vindictive and vile eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth madness mode through which those concerned imagine themselves to be masters of life and death and judges of fellow human beings, and they say goodbye to the moral sidelines.
the fact is,
Around 60% of earthly humanity is part of the so-called Judeo-Christian Islamic world. This means that in interpersonal, individual, and socio-political terms, more or less all areas of life are influenced in various ways by religious faith. This religious imprinting takes place from birth through parents, relatives, and a multitude of other personal influences, and everything culminates in the belief that Adonai, Jehovah, Yahweh, God, Jesus, Holy Spirit, or Allah corresponds to an acting individuality that supervises, guides, and, depending on the case, punishes the individual human being. This belief leads to peculiar ways of thinking and acting. For example, in the case of Judaism, to the 613 mitzvot, in the case of Islam, to the rules of prayer and fasting, as well as the pilgrimage to Mecca to throw stones at the Kaaba, at the invisible Satan, and in the case of Christianity, to baptism, which actually corresponds to an exorcism, and the threat of purgatory as a disciplinary measure, and so on. With regard to Christianity, it is overlooked that it is not a monotheistic religion, but a polytheism. A polytheism because its supreme might is formed by the trio of the Lord God, the Son Jesus Christ, and the Holy Spirit, because, as is well known, the Son and the Holy Spirit sit next to God, the Father. If the matter is explored further, these three religions and their deity actually only exist because first, Hebrew scribes wrote down various orally transmitted stories about 4,000 years ago, which were summarized as the Torah or Talmud. Then, about 1900 years ago, another compilation of various stories was bundled into what is now called the New Testament, though only translations of these stories remain, not the originals in Aramaic. As the third of the holy books, the Quran emerged from another collection of stories long after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. So if these books had not been written and handed down, 1. None of these three religions would exist, and 2. The propagated God would still be unknown, which is probably why an alternative creation myth would have prevailed theoretically. Since this is not the case, however, it must be noted that the Judeo-Christian Islamic God is said to have created the universe and human beings, for this is stated in the Bible, as well as the fact that in earlier times this God interfered quite brutally in earthly affairs, displaying character traits and committing deeds that would probably earn him an indictment at the War Crimes Tribunal today for the documented greatest crime of all time, the genocide triggered by a flood, that is to say, the extermination of the human beings. That is to say, the extermination of all humanity by drowning. In comparison, the crime of the alleged deportation of children without death attributed to Vladimir Putin fades into insignificance. However, it is left to the believers to analyze the tension between logic and illogic, because both freedom of belief and freedom of thought must be respected, especially in today's intolerant world. Nevertheless, I would like to pose a hypothetical question. What would have happened on our Earth in terms of development and warfare if, instead of the Hebrew Israelite mythology, that of the ancient Greeks, Zeus, etc., or Norse mythology, Thor, etc., had spread?
The fact is,
the opposite of faith is not knowledge, but the application of logic, reason, and understanding. Belief is the taking for granted of something unreal that can never be proven to be reality because of its inexistence. Through an unbiased, neutral, and open-minded attitude when observing and studying nature, all life forms and their behavior, becoming and passing away, the difference between a living person and a corpse, the creation of ideas and creativity, etc., again in knowledge results which sooner or later becomes the certainty that everything that exists exists only because an omnipresent, invisible energy and force animates everything. The fact that this creation energy cannot be personalized, that is to say, corresponds to something quite different from a speaking God and material human thoughts, is a further learning effect that leads to the realization and knowledge that every human being is a small universe of his or her own in the great whole, and as such can empower himself or herself to use logic, reason, and intellect, as well as the various senses to move forward in reality without faith, in order to take full responsibility for one's own thinking and the resulting feelings and actions as a master of one's own destiny, and to shape one's own life with verve and joy.
Conclusion.
In the entire universe and in all areas without exception, the iron and unchangeable law of cause and effect and interaction applies. The belief that human beings are guided or punished by supernatural forces or God makes it impossible for them to realize, among other things, that they themselves, and they alone, should bear the responsibility for everything they think, feel, and do, or do not do, at least if their brain is intact. This is probably due to the fact that the majority of humanity is not capable, on the one hand, to define the basic problem behind all major social and environmental problems and to recognize it as the main problem, and on the other hand, to then combat it causally or to save what remains to be saved. Problems can only be solved if the lever is applied to the cause instead of the symptoms. The illusion that this major problem, which is about to be mentioned, can be solved technologically is a mental fallacy, because soft, that is to say social and interpersonal factors, are decisive and effective for this, which are based on ethically and morally positive values such as understanding, reason, logic, self-responsibility, foresight, compassion, and sobriety. As a conclusion to this article essay, there follows a kind of psychological test that gives clues to the functioning of one's own thought world in relation to logic, reason, and understanding.
The initial situation.
For many years, the world population has been growing by 90 to 110 million human beings annually. Some countries are experiencing a decrease in population, for example, Russia. Others are growing rapidly, Sahel countries, while in some countries the proportion of people over 65 is increasing. Japan, in certain African countries, well over 50% of the population is less than 25 years old. Every human being has a primary right to food, clothing, and protection from the elements, as well as to protection of their dignity, freedom of speech, and expression. As a result of procreation and pregnancy, he also has the right to an upbringing and an education and training appropriate to his cultural sphere, so that later, as an adult human being, he can take responsibility for shaping his own life. Every human being, without exception, is, albeit to varying degrees, a consumer of services of all kinds from the embryonic stage until and including death, as well as of food, clothing, shelter, heating, refrigeration, transport, leisure, education, hobbies, media use, etc., and from birth to burial, an emitter of CO2, methane, other exhaust gases, scrap metal, detergent and drug residues, as well as hormones, etc., in wastewater, waste heat, noise, destruction of landscapes through the mining of metals and rare earths, etc., for the production of materials and objects acquired and disposed of during life, through any consumption of plastics and synthetics, because these are produced from fossil energy materials, etc., etc. Normally, as soon as a human being's income covers the primary expenses for food, clothing, and he or she wants to afford some comfort. That is to say, make additional purchases. Nowadays, these are primarily information and entertainment devices, an own transport vehicle, and increasingly meat on the plate. This also applies to all new human beings joining the world community every year, especially when they reach or exceed the age of teenagers. Everything that can be materially created has to be produced somewhere. With new sources of raw materials, most of the necessary ore mines, etc., and the associated emissions are fortunately far away from Europe, so that one is not unnecessarily mentally burdened when buying a new smartphone or leased electric vehicle every 2 or 3 years, and connected with corresponding transports, of which far more than 90% will take place by means of engines powered by fossil fuels for the time being. Due to the exodus from the countryside to cities, which act like magnets, these cities are growing upwards and proliferating like cancer cells into the surrounding landscape. Forests are being cleared for the construction of houses and energy production, as well as for cultivation areas, and are being replaced by monocultures, among other things. The groundwater levels are sinking due to overuse or drought, which in turn is increasing due to climate change, while more precipitation is falling elsewhere. The atmosphere is constantly being polluted and poisoned by ever-new chemicals and the associated chemical-physical reactions, and despite net zero CO2 slogans, which leads to a steady increase in diseases and allergies, etc., etc. The longer this quantitative growth and destruction process is idly watched and nothing is causally done against it, the more nature will be destroyed, and the faster the foundations of life will be irrevocably destroyed, not only for human beings, but also for nature's ecosystems with fauna and flora. And now, the test as a conclusion, combined with the task of finding the logic.
Statement number 1.
Overpopulation is the big taboo that is practically ignored or trivialized by politics, churches of all kinds, business, most environmental and animal protection organizations, the climate youth and the so-called green-red parties, etc. It is not recognized that the enormous global population growth increases all other problems, for example, as a result of resource consumption and emissions of all kinds. The principle is simple. The more human beings sit around a table with a cake, the smaller the pieces of cake become. If the cake pieces are to remain the same size, more cakes have to be baked, that is to say, more ingredients have to be produced somewhere and transported from there. In addition, the larger the number of cake eaters, the more frequently the toilet is used. Since population growth is the cause, but man-made climate change, environmental pollution, the over-exploitation of nature, density stress, and the associated social problems, etc., are the symptoms. The lever must be applied to the basic problem, provided that the will to save the world is a genuine concern and not an adolescent, idealistic, fashionable, emotional upsurge. It follows that the lever must be applied to growth, and the annual population growth must be radically reduced. Logically, this can only be done by immediately reducing the birth rate worldwide in the direction of the death rate. The only possible humane measure to achieve this goal is contraception. This, however, leads us to the aforementioned realization that this problem can only be solved on the cognitive level. However, the mental hurdles involved, the required change of consciousness, are so high that this is a call-in-the-desert case. This means that, unfortunately, it is already certain that the urgently needed radical operation to remove the skin cancer will not be carried out, and that, due to the continued formation of metastases, the patient Earth will be left to fend for himself. But who knows? Maybe the patient will use his self-healing powers, and by using earthquakes, floods, icing and dehydration, and burning out by volcanoes and exploding calderas, he will succeed in destroying a large part of the vermin plaguing him, and then continue to exist scarred more badly than well. It should be added that the objection that for demographic reasons, that is to say, to secure pensions, a steady population growth or a steady immigration of young workers into over-aged societies is necessary. Experts use the term demographic catastrophe, is so short-sighted, egoistic, and harebrained in view of the real threat situation that the demographic rivets making such demands disgrace themselves as ignorant members of the Church of the Believers in eternal material progress.
Statement number 2.
The Earth can easily support many more billions of human beings. Besides, the growth will slow down of its own accord as soon as all women worldwide have enjoyed a school education, because experience shows that birth rates fall as education increases. So there is no need for action to implement population reduction measures. Panic is unnecessary. Overpopulation is not the problem, but the unfair distribution of food and the exploitative treatment of developing countries. As the issue of food waste shows, there is enough food available worldwide, but there is no willingness to distribute it fairly. Demands for birth control in poor countries are an impertinence and a sign of colonial thinking and behavior. Furthermore, the ecological footprint in industrialized countries is much higher than in developing countries, which is why it is not our place to measure these countries with the same yardstick in terms of net zero CO2 measures. Overpopulation is not a relevant problem, but is misused by right-wing populists and Nazis to discriminate against refugees and spread hatred. Ultimately, this discussion leads to the murder of human beings, for example, through wars and rampantly spreading diseases, in order to reduce the population. In the Third Reich, we saw where this leads. The one-child policy in China has led to horrific crimes, and in the meantime, China has realized that too much has been curbed in terms of population growth and that there is a labor shortage. The economy needs labor. For demographic reasons, that is to say, to secure pensions, steady population growth is necessary, and this is the case in all countries that are shrinking in terms of population. Refugees are to be seen and used as a potential and an opportunity, as well as part of the reparation for colonial crimes. Refugees are to be integrated and thereby make their contribution to securing our pensions. If urban space is further densified, there is room for everyone